The Battle of Britain is about to begin.
We got tanks up there. Let's follow a range on Detroit. I'm coming around that on the target right now. I've got a couple of these right in front of me. I'm going out there. Right, I
got him. Welcome back to the Lead Pursuit Podcast. Tonight, we're going back to the books. We're going back to discuss history. And we're not going to discuss it in the usual fanboy sense, where we're talking about how great aces are, how wonderful specific soldiers have been. We're really going to dig into some of the uncomfortable and darker sides of this history. And we're going to ask some questions that might be tough and that people might not want to know the answers to. But the point is, in reading any history out there, we're going to look to find something that we can take away. Now, I've had the pleasure of reading through Erik Schmidt's book, Black Tulip, which is all about Erich Hartmann. And we're fortunate to have Erik on the podcast tonight to talk about his book. Thanks for joining us, Erik.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Absolutely. It's always good to have another author on. And I brought Steve and Brett back, and I'll short circuit all their happy discussion between themselves about how much they're freezing, how warm it is in Florida, and everything else to say, Steve, you are going to make it through winter, right? We don't have to emergency evac you to Florida.
I will make it. I actually scheduled an emergency trip, so I'm going to be visiting Brett down there in the free state of Florida, doing some actual tabletop gaming here in a little bit. So it'll be a fun time.
I know. I think the rumor is, Brett, we're bringing an RV and parking in front of your apartment complex. Is that okay?
Yeah, what's the guy from Christmas Vacation where the uncle shows up?
Exactly. What could possibly go wrong? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's pretty much us. Well, let's skip all the usual lead pursuit banter and let's hop right into the book. So, Erik, I'm going to use your own words against you when we're talking about Black Tulip here.
Fair enough.
You wrote in there, any work of history tells you about the author just as it tells you about the subject. And I think that's something really key for people to understand when they pick up your book, is that it isn't, as we say, the standard fanboy analysis of an ace, this fawning picture over how wonderful they were, and disregarding some of the deeper, tougher questions that have to be asked. But instead, it's really kind of picking it apart. But in the process of picking apart the truth, you tend to learn a little bit about you, Erik. So I think that's fascinating. What kind of brought you to thinking about a biography of Hartmann specifically in that way?
Well, that's an idea that's shown up for me in reading history my whole life, as a kid and as an adult. But one of the things that really hit me over the head once I started going into Hartmann's life and reading what there was about him is this idea that history has always been handled by someone before it gets to us, right? So someone else has already been in charge of the storytelling. Usually they've made decisions about how the conversation's conducted, what to include, what not to include, and who gets to tell the story, who has the power and the trust to tell the story, right? And so the way that we conduct this conversation, I think, really does tell us about that context, the author and the nature of the conversation, just like it tells us about the subject.
Well, we always tend to give it lip service and we say, victors write the history. But I think in this case, we end up looking at an interesting situation that we'll explore as we talk through it in the podcast tonight, where, yes, the victors wrote the history, but it was a glowing history rather than a damning history. And so you end up having to analyze what are the motivations, what are the reasons for these things being written, and either topics not addressed, uncomfortable questions not asked, or other deeper historical exploration not being done. And to me, that's almost as fascinating, if not more fascinating, than the actual biography of the individual. So, I think you probably will say that there was a lot of motivation there to shine a light in places that hadn't been, but also to do something different.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that was kind of what grabbed my interest once I started doing the work. I mean, I started the book because I'm obsessed with aviation and have been all my life. But I finished it because it taught me so many things that I did not expect to learn, and I couldn't stop.
Let's talk about your formative exposures to aviation, because once again, people may say, who is this Erik Schmidt? What does he know about aviation? And why has he taken on, either praising or poking in the eye the guy that has 352 plus kills?
Well, nerd is my main job title when it comes to aviation. I mean, I've been into it my whole life. I grew up wanting to be an aeronautical engineer, precisely until the time when I hit college physics and calculus, at which point
See, you're much smarter than Brett. Brett, what was your major?
No,
Yeah, I was the guy that went to Embry-Riddle for engineering and went in the Army.
Well,
so you see, it didn't work out for him either.
The last part of that path, though, was going to be until I immediately retreated to the humanities, because I knew that the engineering path wasn't what I was going to be able to be doing for 8 hours a day. So in college I ended up majoring in philosophy and history, which actually was a wonderful choice for me, and it worked out great. And I was fortunate that I was in a college where you can make a change like that, and kind of figure out yourself and what you need to do along the way. I think about the very beginning when I was just a kid. I mean, I think I started out being obsessed with space, real space, Gemini, Apollo, the moon missions and all that. And then it was undersea exploration with submersibles going and discovering the Titanic. It was always kind of from a sort of scientific exploratory point of view. And then I landed on aviation, and it stuck. To me, the field of aviation is just this container of the whole human experience, right? I mean, you can see successes, failures, heroes, villains, awesome decision-making, horrible decision-making, comically horrible decision-making, like the whole lot. You can find just about any kind of story you want in aviation, and it's always just kind of had a gravitational pull on me.
So with a background in touching aviation, and I laugh that you kind of went through some of the similar progressions I did. Obviously I spent a lot of my time growing up around Huntsville, Alabama, so I was brainwashed into space at an early age. uh, Moved on from that, realizing that I didn't want to be a physicist, much less an astrophysicist.
There you go.
And then doing, oceanographic things. I tell the story of I wanted to be an ocean engineer until I sat in the in-brief for ocean engineering, and they said the first 2 years of mechanical engineering, and I walked out the door and said, "Where was oceanography again? Where are the fish and rocks?" So I have fled from engineering much as you have, but coming from those backgrounds and then doing aviation things for the majority of my military career. It's interesting to see somebody else who has been bitten by the aviation bug, but thankfully you didn't get the fatal variety like I did that led you down a career in a very pigeonholed fashion to doing some certain things. You obviously had the ability, as you went through a variety of academia, to change your course, and then I find it funny how you have gone from that kind of a background to where you find yourself working today, not in a field as an academic professor or anything, but as a writer who also does work in business. But let's talk about how did an advisor's question kind of turn into a biographical exercise for Erich Hartmann? How did you end up kind of, I don't want to say getting shamed into writing about Erich Hartmann, but that's almost the way you make it sound in your book.
Well, yeah, the advisor you're talking about was in grad school, and this was sort of a fork in the road for me where I was in grad school for writing, and I was having to decide because the program I was in was creative nonfiction, which sounds kind of like a contradiction, but it's not, I promise. And the decision that I had to make, most people in a program like that are actually there because they want to write memoir. They want to write about their life, right? But I wasn't really into that. I wanted to write research-based nonfiction about other real things out in the world that can teach us things. And so this advisor, she asked me at one point when we were planning the semester, what are you going to write about, Schmidt? And I said, baseball or airplanes.
Yeah,
And
there's two opposite ends of the spectrum.
well, right.
Oh, wait, no, they both have big egos. They have big egos involved and lots
true,
of money.
true.
So
You can connect the dots, I'm sure, in a few ways. But she looked at me as puzzled as you think that she might. And baseball would have been the memoir route, because I mean, I played baseball all my life. I played in college. It was a huge part of my formative years, and I figured, well, I could dredge up some semi-useful stories and talk about that. But what I really wanted to do was talk about aviation and go into history and really make it a formal part of that graduate experience to really dive in and learn research and learn how to research hard, tangible things, and then interpret and analyze and present them as a writer, using all the tools that I could put together to do that. And so what she said immediately after that was, okay, tell me about 3 pilots you know of. Because, I think she could tell that the stories are with the people, as much as I might want to write about how amazing the landing gear retraction mechanism on a MiG-23 is.
that's apparently about all that all the grognards we deal with read. They don't.
Well,
They just want to tell us how wonderful the airplanes are, and people actually fly these things. Yes.
we can relate. I mean, I've spent many an hour on YouTube looking at landing gear sequences and all that kind of stuff. But I listed off. I think it was Chuck Yeager, Amelia Earhart, and Erich Hartmann. And Hartmann was the guy I knew the least about, and she didn't know anything about him. But he was also, he was immediately the most promising one and the most interesting one of the group. I think partly because he was so unknown to both of us. I knew his basic background. I knew kind of the encyclopedia version of him. But we got talking about the Black Tulip, the symbol that he had on his plane at certain points during the war, and then later, in what became West Germany when he was in the Bundeswehr, the new German military. He had those painted on his sabers, actually, and that just kind of I could read her interest in it, and that we just sort of fed into this research project. So I kind of got into it in grad school, and then after I was done, enough people around me were like, look, this is a book you should consider keeping going on it. And so then after I was done, I started writing Black Tulip.
Well, I have to let you know what a charmed life you have lived, and you may not realize it. But for those of us like me that spent a career in military aviation, I have had Hartmann, Galland, Belkey, all beat into my brain from an early age. So it must have been pleasant for you to discover Erich Hartmann. Unfortunately, since day one of my military flying career, Hartmann and so many of these aces are, in a sense, beat into you. And Brett can probably say from the Ranger side, there's very much a ground equivalent that we often laugh about old dead German sayings. And so if there's any saying that's painted on the wall over a command center, over a squadron ready room or something, there's better than even chance it was given by an old dead German. But that's just how post-war American military theory has been done. That so much of it has been driven by digging up what many of the German aces, the German generals, and others said, because if you're going to write a quote from Montgomery over the top of your command center, is it going to be, I've got no idea what I'm doing? That was to piss off all my UK listeners. So sorry, tough luck. I didn't like Montgomery. Anyway, so to go on, I'm going to once again use your own words against you here, because I think it's a great quote about the book itself. And you say, Black Tulip is not an expose, but a declaration of who Hartmann was. It's not a hero building exercise, but also not a condemnation. What the real story is, we will never fully know. His life is hard to solve. And that's kind of where I want to start this discussion tonight, is that I don't want us to let ourselves get polarized, because it's very easy to read what someone else writes and to either take offense to it or to say, but wait, you forgot, or do any one of those things. I want us to take a look at the book, realizing that there's a lot of uncomfortable piece to it, but it's not an expose. It's not meant there to show something that is creating drama. It's meant to explore who he really was, rather than as you have said, and I know many of us feel, his previous history has been sculpted. It's been handed to us by people who may have had ulterior motives, some good, some bad, but rather a an attempt to not tell the whole story, because the whole story might not have been palatable. It might have been a little uncomfortable.
Yeah, I mean that was my goal from the beginning, was to try to kind of tread the middle ground, right? I mean, because it can be just as shallow to swing that pendulum the other direction and try to make him into some, dastardly Nazi, and not talk about any of the context or the complexity, or anything like that, right? And so, in a way, I kind of wanted to remove a little bit of the adrenaline from the story and just sort of sit with what we had, and just kind of resist this temptation toward a really neat, tidy black and white conclusion in either direction, and try to give it another look, and just kind of see where it took us. I'm sort of thinking now about why I picked Hartmann back in school as a subject, and I think it had something to do with, I knew of him, I knew his claim to fame, I knew a heck of a lot more about the BF 109 and all these sort of mileposts in his life. But in the beginning, I didn't have an especially strong opinion about him in either direction, right? And so I think what that told me in some sort of way was, this was going to be a chance for me to go into the history and let the history show me what I ought to think, rather than going in with a preconceived notion that I'm just trying to validate. And so that was kind of the exercise for my own sake as a writer that I thought this could be really useful for. And in the end, that was validated. I mean, that was how it turned out, that, the polarized black and white, heavy-handed declaration about, Erich Hartmann as a man was not, in either direction, was not what I thought would be the right way to go.
Well, before we kind of break down the phases of the book, I want to throw it over to Brett for a moment, because I think it's interesting how people will read through the book and know what the purpose of your writing is. Yet it's interesting how we focus on different things, and we put concern, or I don't want to say we take offense, but we there are certain words that are more of a hot button for us in certain ways. Brett, hearing what Eric has said, how does that change, kind of the discussion we had earlier today about what things were emphasized, maybe overemphasized or underemphasized in your mind?
Well, I mean, I was telling Doug earlier, I didn't really go into the book knowing what to expect, and I hadn't read a lot of history on any of the aces, much less Hartmann, and I guess I was just assuming it was going to be sort of an expose of his experiences in combat, and it was a lot deeper than that, right? It was more of a discussion about who he was as a man, and I appreciated that, and I learned some things too. And one of the things I think you point out that I was unaware of is that some of the previous history that's written, is told from a lens that might be inappropriately too generous. Not to say that you discovered anything about Hartmann that made him out to be, some vile character or anything like that. But anyway, I think that you've explained that, like you said, you weren't trying to characterize him on really any end of the spectrum. And I can see how in after reading your book, you seem to explore, what you discovered about the man.
Well, that's what kind of fascinated me, going through the phases. So I will spoil it for the readers in a sense to say, if you expect to jump straight into hearing dogfight stories about Erich Hartmann, this is not your book. You should go read a different one. Am I pretty right in saying that, Eric?
Well, I mean, the Red Baron shows up pretty quick, but yes,
I did laugh about that. I was like, wait a minute, did I pick up the wrong book and read the wrong PDF? How am I suddenly reading about the Red Baron? So I thought that was funny. But once again, the reason that's in there is if I break your book down into, in a sense, 5 different phases, which is probably not how you saw it, but tough luck. It's my podcast. It's how I saw it.
No, I want to hear how you do it. Yeah.
You really talked a lot about the formative. And because of that, that's why the Red Baron story is extremely applicable, because not only is that importantly formative for the Luftwaffe as a whole, it's informative, or it's formative to the narration of a hero story by the opponent. And I think that is something that we rarely analyze. We do a lot of, and I know Brett has a landmine of a question for you later on, talking about Axis aces, and just sometimes we hero worship them, sometimes we just never talk about them. But anyway, so the first phase is kind of the formative. Then you do talk about the wartime service. You spend a while talking about his time in captivity, which I think is vitally important to any discussion of his biography. Mm-hmm. You talk about, as I call it, the post-war reinvention, which all of us tend to do in some form or other. Post your regular career, you have to get a real job, but that reinvention, and then you really go into some pretty heavy analysis in my mind, and some I will shallowly call them deep thoughts, but you ask some tough questions, and I think those are the kind of things that I found that part of the book the most excruciating to read, but not because it was poorly written. It was excruciating because I had to stop and think. And that's not something most history books do to you. Most biographies do not do that. But I thought it was very interesting that you had finished telling the story of the individual's life, and you said, but wait, there's more. We're not done talking yet.
Well,
so tell us a little bit about how you saw that, the phasing of the book in your mind.
Well, I hope the payoff was worth it there. At the end,
I did. I enjoyed the book. So don't get me wrong. Most of my time was spent digesting the last, I think it's 2 chapters. It was painful. I had to go back. I had to reread. I wanted to make sure I wasn't misrepresenting. But yes, it was not a easy read. It was a pleasurable read, and those are 2 different things.
Sure. Well, I mean, your breakdown makes plenty of sense to me. That's how it kind of existed in my brain when I was doing it. Although the thing that comes to mind is that there's actually a phase 0 or a different phase 1. And that really, at least in my mind, and that's the introduction, where I'm really kind of trying to have a discussion with the reader and say, okay, here's the deal. Here's who I am. Here's what's going on here. Here's what this book is not. And here's what we can, here's our mission as we kind of go and learn together through it. And, the introduction and the conclusion, with very few exceptions, those are the only places where the word I shows up in the book, right?
Thankfully, and it was the only place you explained things to me, which was nice. I
Sure.
I didn't feel like I was being author-splained to throughout the entire book.
Oh, good. Yeah, I mean, preaching is not my chosen vocation. So I hope to avoid that as much as I can. Although, like all of us, I'm prone to it sometimes.
Well, but I will say, I think your introduction was key in that it set the stage. What I will say is that I read it and I'm like, oh, excellent. So I should show up to this wearing my big boy pants. I should I should not show up this with my emotions on my sleeve, which I think is probably good for most readers, because you don't know your reader's background. You don't know how open they are. They may have literally picked up the book thinking they were going to read 352 dogfight stories, which it is not. So I think you did a good job there in, as you call it, your phase 0, kind of setting the expectations.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think some readers have had that experience, where, Black Tulip is sort of, it's a half step off from a lot of other works that I would read in the aviation history kind of section, and so I figured, well, if I have this different kind of project, then especially if one of my central claims is that every work of history tells you about the author, just as it tells you about the subject, well then,
I should tell you about myself.
Yeah, right. I mean, if I'm going to make that claim, then I shouldn't just magically exempt myself from it, right? I should hold myself to my own test, right? And so that was, I wanted to be pretty intentional, both in sort of setting that expectation and defining that, but then also briefly coming back to it at the very end to sort of say, like, okay, what happened? Where are we at?
Well, thank you for putting it that way, because that's about how I felt when I got to the end, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But for at least for me, and I'll be honest, the first phase to me, the formative phase, was really the most interesting, and I think that comes from who some of my closest friends are that are either descendants of Holocaust survivors, or one of my good friends who actually has a degree in Holocaust studies, Holocaust
Yeah.
and genocide studies. And so it was really fascinating to me, because with this group of friends, we've had so many discussions between history, between current world events, whether it's things going on in Asia with ethnic cleansing, conflicts I've found myself in Europe with ethnic cleansing, things like that, where we have a discussion about collective guilt and the collective ability of people to either maintain an identity while unfortunately achieving the the aims of whatever organization is attempting to do whatever dastardly deeds. It's one of those
Yeah.
really interesting discussions, and I thought it was interesting how much it resonated with me when you discussed the public and private lives of German citizens, because it harkened back to my childhood. And obviously, growing up for my teenage years on in Huntsville, Alabama, yes, I had lots of friends who were descended from German rocket scientists,
Yeah,
and that
sure.
was a fascinating cultural thing to grow up in. Mr. Redneck boy from Alabama who was barely wearing shoes, growing up with the sons and grandsons and granddaughters of German rocket scientists. But I think you're absolutely right there, because you discuss how there was an entire private discourse that I was fortunate enough to witness in a few ethnically German families that I know I didn't see in many of them, because they were very much status quo kind of people on the outside, and not at all on the inside. So was that kind of a surprise to you as you dug through and talked to more people about the German citizenry during that time?
Well, it was one idea that kind of unlocked things for me a little bit, because sometimes we tend to kind of talk about the Germans or the ordinary Germans as a herd, right? As if they
Yes,
were
we do a
kind
lot
of,
of times.
pretty much the same, and they were either all complicit and evil, or they were all, innocent and separated, right? And it just seemed to me that there must be more complexity there than that, right? And even person to person, right? So the public private distinction you mentioned was actually deliberate on the part of the Nazis to allow for that, to leave room for a sense of routine and normalcy on sort of the family level, but even I think of individual people, Hartman or anybody else. I mean, you have to think that not only did individuals vary in how they interacted with all of this and dealt with, I mean, basically the trauma of the time, but individuals themselves would have evolved over time in how they thought about it and engaged with it and conducted themselves in public versus private. So there seems just there seemed to be so much more fluidity and kind of granular complexity to how this worked among the Germans than we really think about very often. So that was one kind of research milestone that helped it all sit in my brain, where I could think, okay, yeah, this as a system, this as a phenomenon could hold together, I guess.
Well, I think there's a discussion that you actually have later on in the book about, we tend to view anyone's viewpoint from, let's say, 1935 to 1945 as never changing and never evolving. And you say that's obviously not going to be true. We all
Right.
change and evolve over time, but we tend to, in the discussion about the rise and the flow of the Nazi Party, that we assume what people believed on day one is what they believed at the end of the fall of the Reich, and that either nobody became disillusioned, nobody became aware of what was going on. And I was even reading it today as I was reading some comments from a variety of German pharmaceutical companies, because one of my favorite, I don't know, I'll be honest, it's called a conspiracy theory because it is. But one of the interesting discussions is about the flow of German pharmaceutical money through Swiss banks back to the U.S., and then back from the U.S. after the post-war back into into German holdings, and some discussions about that. And it's just fascinating though to go back and do the analysis and say, okay, who cares where the money went and whether it was actually transferred? Let's look at who the people were, and let's look at, were these people that probably, obviously backed as industrialists the rise of the Nazi Party. We can't assume they had the same feeling in 1943 when they suddenly realized what was going on and said, do we ride this out? Do we undermine the regime? What do we do? And I think you do a good job, especially in the analysis section, coming back and saying, hey, people's attitudes obviously changed. People may have even said and done things and signed up for things early on that they may not have believed even a year later.
Yeah, it's true, and I had a conversation with a guy who shows up in the book. His name's Rudy Florian, and he's he's been a Holocaust educator his whole life. He was a kid in Hitler Youth, briefly kind of got out of being in it too much, and then he emigrated to the U.S. and spent 30 years in the U.S. Air Force, before he became an educator. And I was sitting down with him, and I asked him at one point, what would you, if Erich Hartmann were sitting next to us at this table having a beer with us, what would you want to know, or what would you ask him? And his response was, I would want to know how, what he has learned and how he has changed over the years. I mean, that was where his interest was, so he was just he was aware of just what you're talking about, where people's lives are fluid and their ideas are fluid, and hopefully, you can establish a trajectory, I think is where he was kind of going with it. But yeah, you have to be able to hold that complexity, I think, if you want to view people as full humans.
Well, and I think we'll talk about it here, stepping into the second phase. There's a move from discussing Hartmann probably in the terms that he would like to be thought of as a loyal German citizen, signing up and doing all those good aviation things that his mother would have directed him to do, and building him into be that young youth that the German country would have been proud of. And then you end up in wartime service. And I guess I should say thank you for not filling it full of stories of aces being aces. I think you do a good job of discussing the aviation things there, but I think it goes to the one of the questions that Brett has kind of posed is, wasn't Erich Hartmann kind of the poster child for what the Luftwaffe wanted? And as he finds himself all of a sudden in service on the Eastern Front, is he realizing this is not what I signed up for? This is not flying gliders.
I mean, he definitely was. He had the insulation of his racial and religious identity. He was really well suited for the kind of the path into the Hitler Youth and the training and the gliding, and then eventually the Luftwaffe. And I mean, it helped, for example, that his mother was a pilot, right? I mean, she was a very accomplished pilot in a time and a context where women pilots were few and far between. And so there are plenty of reasons why it made sense for him to have the path that he did, as a glider student and then a leader and going to the Air Force. But one of the most devastating and sad and strategic things that the Nazis did was they created boyhood and girlhood. They created this experience of youth and this trajectory, because they needed the young people.
Well, and Brett, what are your thoughts on that? Because I know, like we talked about, there's a moment where you feel bad for Hartmann because he's kind of the poster child for it, and it's almost like he's disposed to do this job.
Yeah, I think Eric touches on that in the book about how, I don't know how you put it exactly, but how the regime was churning their citizenry into this effort and were consuming the children of the nation to feed into this thing. And he's like the prime candidate for this whole effort, right? I mean, it's as I'm reading it, I was thinking how he was athletic, he was handsome, he was a skilled glider pilot. He just was ticking off all the check boxes to be just a prime candidate. And by I guess by your own research, it seemed he was rising through the ranks in the Hitler Youth. So he was certainly on that trajectory to be a rising star should he survive in the Luftwaffe.
Yeah, I mean, he was good at a lot of things that were rewarded, programmatically, like in terms of the structure and how they set it all up. There's sort of one thing that I was interested by was just this focus on athletics and the physical and the kind of the outward qualities as opposed to braininess and intellectual development and all that. I mean that was de-emphasized. That was in fact smothered in a lot of ways. But man, I mean Hartmann barreling off ski jumps and just having the talents that he did just naturally out of the gate. That made him pretty well suited and desirable for for kind of cultivation by the people who are in charge.
Well, I think this is where it starts, at least for me, to have a feeling of discomfort. And it's not quite totally uncomfortable yet, but it's one of those moments where my mind kind of races ahead a little bit and I start making historical connections. And I know I'm going to receive hate mail and comments and everything else for this, and I will be the first to say I am a huge supporter of scouting. However, scouting is a paramilitary organization. And we have a lot of those vestiges still in the United States where we have organizations that were designed to sculpt the youth of a nation for service and to imbue a nation's values in them, whether they're the same values that we have today. Let's not have that's not the discussion. The purpose of these things was to sculpt the future of a youth, and that was very much a 1930s, 1940s way of viewing the world. And I think for me, this was the first point to go, let me step back and look as an American and say, what things have we done that have either driven choices in my own life or driven choices in the life of my friends that are because of organizations that ostensibly had a national purpose, whether or not they had also great things about camaraderie and learning about yourself, learning about how you behave in difficult situations. I think people could even say from some of the Volksmarches and things, people learned about themselves. They didn't necessarily need to learn about what Hitler and everybody else was doing for them.
Yeah, that was interesting to me too. I mean, what came to my mind when I was kind of going through that phase was there seems to be kind of two components to this, where there's sort of the philosophy to organizations like that, and then there's the practice, right? And
Absolutely.
the practice, I think, was at least as important as anything for Hartmann and all the other youngsters, because they were out on these hikes. They were out, really building this sense of kind of codependency and camaraderie and connection. And this is during a social and political time when, I mean, this is, the interwar period, and then before the war, where, Weimar had failed, things were not good. The young people often had sort of these gaping holes in their life experience of leadership and camaraderie and sort of a sense of connectivity to mentors and things like that. And so the practices and the excursions, the physical element, all of this, I mean, it filled a need for people, especially in that specific time and place.
Well, and historians will tell you, and unfortunately, I remember this from all my martial heritage classes and all those other things, that the Germanic history has so much been that history of collective doing, and that it's a tribal history in a lot of ways, but the larger the German leaders could make the tribe, the more powerful they could make the nation. And that nationhood wasn't necessarily a thought that entered into everyone's mind. But if you could have shared experiences, then your tribe became larger than just the people who lived in the village with you. And so it's a interesting manipulation of, inherently Germanic traits. But at the same time, I think you do a great job discussing, that there are benefits to that then stood Hartmann in good stead further on in his life. And as you go into his wartime service, I do laugh that I think you start that section off talking about all the things he got wrong, which is fascinating because I never even knew about the Stuka crash. So I laugh about that one. Congratulations, put the young guy out over his skis and give him an airplane he's not qualified in to fly. But it was interesting to me to read how you started that, and it was very much not trying to paint a picture of a perfect aviator. This is a young aviator finding himself partway through the war that is now being asked to do things well outside of his skill level.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up. I mean, that wasn't a way to sort of say, hey everybody, Hartman screwed up too. What actually comes to my mind there is Hartman talked about himself differently than his supporters talked about him, right? He was more willing to be kind of, to show his flaws, or to talk about
He
mistakes
seems
he
more
made.
self-deprecating, as aviators either can kind of fall in one of two camps. They either never made a mistake, or they love to tell you their mistakes and go, "I was an absolute moron." And he seems more of the latter in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, he was a pretty blunt kind of character. He didn't say a whole lot in public, but when he got talking about things, he told them how they were, and I think if he was in a conversation with someone about those early days, he would talk about how he damn near shot himself down, or literally did shoot himself down, sometimes by flying through the shrapnel of these other planes, and his first foibles, out there on the front trying to get his footing. It's almost, it's only after the fact, when you get sort of back to that historical storytelling and that filtering that other people did on his behalf, that you really get the spit polished, super infallible, heroic kind of vibe.
Which is fascinating because while obviously, as I've said, coming from a military history background and military aviation, know Hartman for his large number of kills. I too also know Hartman for his lesson of running out of gas on that first fight, and
Oh yeah, yeah.
and 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 that has always been kind of something that was interesting as I read this book. Was I realized that not everybody may have been instructed in I'll call it the mythology of Erich Hartmann, the same way that I had been. And that one of the first lessons that I remember drawing from Hartmann's sayings, his life, whatever that was beat into me as a young aviator, was that you absolutely have to have situational awareness of where you are in the battlefield, what your aircraft fuel state is, and never get yourself out over your skis into a fight you can't get out of. And it was specifically taken from that one story. So it was interesting that, to me, that is a key part of Hartman, and I suddenly realized that that might not be a key part of everyone else's view of Erich Hartmann.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, that's a very human story, right? I mean, because here he came in from training, and then all of a sudden he was at the front, and the first time he was surrounded, by enemy fighters, he sort of got tunnel vision and lost track of that important priority, right? And that's the sort of thing where I don't think of that as a way to be, to think, oh well, Erich Hartmann wasn't as good as people think he was. That makes him feel more human to me, and that's relatable, right? Because we've all been in situations where man, we're prepared for the job interview or whatever, and then we get there, and we've got dry mouth like you wouldn't believe, and we completely lose sight of one of our priorities or whatever. I mean, to me that was a humanizing story, it actually was pretty formative for him, because I think he very seriously took a lesson from that, and he learned from it, and he got a real talking to about it, and we all know that he succeeded at that.
Well, so I kind of chuckle because I I for many years took from Erich Hartmann the fact that the best instructors are the ones that tell their worst mistakes first. And for years I
Yeah,
would
sure.
relate to people how, my combat record was, in my first combat experiences, I was 0 for 2. Two missions in Serbia and missed the target both times. And that there was all of those lessons learned that came from missing the target on 2 combat missions rolled into my next combat experiences and were things that I would never make those mistakes again, and procedures I would do, things that I would check before the flight to ensure I didn't make those mistakes again, because those were embarrassing, and those were the red flags that I would tell the young guys, look, don't be a dumbass like Doug. Doug screwed it away. Learn from his mistakes.
Yeah, right.
And so I think that's part of, to me, the Hartmann mythos, was that he was so accomplished, yet he had such an inauspicious start, which I think is definitely something to talk about. Now I know Brett, obviously being our resident ground pounder, seeing things from a different perspective. Brett, what did you take away from his wartime service, specifically when he was shot down and spent time around the infantry?
Oh yeah, and when you're talking about a human story, I really thought it was, superhuman, just how he was appalled to see the combat up close. I mean, what I recall from the story was how, essentially they killed like 200 Soviet dismounts to a man, dismembered them with their machine guns and stuff, just in the brutality of the ambush or whatever it was. And then as soon as it was all over, they stopped and started eating lunch. And it just, I wonder like how that affected him as a man. And the whole story seems to kind of reinforce this notion we have of like the gallant aerial knights and how it's all chivalrous and, it's certainly distant in some regard, perhaps from combat in a more like face-to-face kind of sense. But I guess he got to see it right there. It was interesting. And, it was just a brief snapshot of that, I guess, experience in the book. It was one of those things where I think if I had a chance to talk with him, I'd like to know more about how that affected him, and if it affected him or anything like that.
Yeah, well, I think you're right on. I mean, there is sort of a distance, that I think maybe wasn't something that he had really reckoned with in that kind of way, when he was down on the ground. And this was an SS unit too, so there was sort of an added element of I think that he saw, some of the just sort of outright brutality that those units are known for. And, he's said something after the fact like, I thought that this was a different kind of human, and he was talking about, his countrymen, that they sort of approached it, from this sort of ruthless tactical point of view. And I think he asked them, like, why didn't you take any prisoners? And they said, well, it would have taken resources and or made us vulnerable or something else. I mean, the point, I think, was that it was kind of a jarring experience for him based on kind of the norms of his realm of combat, versus what he found when he was shot down there.
I think that's a very important frame of reference, especially for aviators to have. And I think it's very easy for people to view aviation as surgical, especially in the modern era, where you're so removed from much of the damage you're doing. The weapons are more precise, which also means they also more precisely kill the wrong people, unfortunately at times. But the fact is, aviators and aviation tend to be removed sometimes from the effects they have. And for me, as a Marine aviator who was at least also fortunate enough to be a forward air controller and serve with the infantry for 13 months, it's interesting to see how that changes people. Because what I'll say is, at least in my experience, it was a fascinating difference to, rather than it be striking targets from 25,000 feet, to being the individual calling in the airstrikes on the targets and then going through and exploiting what was left of the target area you had hit. And I think it's a jarring experience for someone if they did sign up truly to believe in the Knights of the Air and the chivalrous gallantry of warfare, and then suddenly you're down in the world of the infantry where it really is not that way at all. And I think so. I think you did a good job talking through that. But I think that's one of those things that will always be an unanswered question: is, how did that really affect Hartmann? And was that the beginning of the disillusionment for him, or did he just kind of flip the switch and say, yes, this is a war, we're doing unsavory things, and I saw some pretty horrific actions on the part of the SS?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. We're kind of just left wondering about it. I think, kind of conjecturing. I mean, he did show a pattern throughout the war of always wanting to go back to his unit, right? I mean, he had a chance at one point to go fly the ME-262, and be sort of one of the initial cohort to check out the plane and go to combat with it. And he didn't want it. He didn't want any part of it. He left. He went back to fly his 109 with his unit. So I think that he really did develop sort of an allegiance or a fondness or a comfort or a something that really kind of drew him back to the familiar, to what he had really bonded to. And that was probably where he thought he could be effective and where he felt most in command of his role and what he was supposed to do.
Right. So let's step forward to that kind of third phase, middle phase of the book, where the Axis surrenders. He goes into captivity. Obviously, where they are at that time, it's conveniently between. They could choose to surrender to the Allies. They could choose to surrender to the United States, surrender to the Russians. There's a belief, hey, maybe we can make it to the British sector, surrender to them, and then trying to do the right thing. He and his command all decide to surrender en masse, and the questions that kind of come out of that. Officers could have escaped to wherever they wanted to. They could have flown to areas that were blatantly U.S., well beyond Soviet occupation. But he finds himself handed back over, along with a number of other Germans, to the Soviets and to some, what I'll say, some fairly brutal handling. The question is always comes up in history is you never want to be the whataboutism kind of people and compare horrific actions as if one can be more horrific than the other. But some terrible things do go on. Brett, I know we talked about Hartmann's decision not to fly out and not to go surrender to the British. I know you had a few questions about that.
Well, this is one of the things that really impressed me. I mean, you touched on it, Eric, that he clearly had some superior bond with his unit, because when he got the order saying for him and one of his other pilots, I can't recall who it was, to fly to the British and surrender to themselves there, and they decided to ignore those orders and to try to load up everybody on a ground convoy and road march to the nearest U.S. lines. That didn't work out so well for him. And I just kind of wonder, surely he thought about that decision when he was sitting in captivity for 10 years. Did he ever remark on that decision point, how he felt about it, if he had regrets about it, or defend, that decision despite the hardships he went through because of it?
I don't think he would have regretted it. I mean, he said that was the only time during the war that he disobeyed an order. When he got explicit instructions, to leave and go to, what everybody thought would be a safer surrender point, and they decided not to do that. He after the fact, he talked about the time in captivity and how he spent a disproportionate amount of time relative to a lot of other soldiers, a lot of other Germans. And I always got the sense that, at least in how he presented himself later, after he had returned and after he was having these conversations with biographers and stuff, that he felt kind of like it was just sort of what he had to do, and that he wasn't going to spend his time navel gazing about it and regretting. Maybe he didn't expedite his own release or anything like that. It's kind of hard to pin down. He was not forthcoming with the feelings in a lot of that ways, as you might expect. But it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I understand there were other pilots who took some grief from their comrades after, Graf comes to mind, I guess. Herman Graf, I guess, maybe was accused of cutting some deal or otherwise, caving into his captors and getting himself a much earlier release than others. Did he discuss that? Or I think he might have touched on that a bit in the book. Is there anything that was revealed in your investigations with Hartmann on those things?
Yeah, that was a frustration for him. There were some some guys who did, they sort of took the deal and they either gave information or they, agreed or sort of manipulated into cooperating more than Hartmann. Because I mean, the thing you take from Hartmann's time in captivity is, cooperative was not, a word to describe, how he treated the Soviets who were in charge of him. He really stuck to his guns. But they were, especially these high-ranking officers who the Soviets thought would have some sort of intelligence or some kind of utility or propaganda use. They were under lots of pressure, and that was mostly psychological. I mean, they definitely had a lot of physical hardship, especially in the beginning when they were kind of moving through the camp system, kind of settling into their eventual places. But there was a lot of kind of posturing and pressuring and baiting and threats and all this to get Hartmann and men like him to do things that may have been expedient, but not necessarily what they wanted to.
So I will say that this was the second most interesting part of the book to me after the the formative laying the groundwork phase, and it's probably because being a graduate of the U.S. Navy's Survival Evasion Resistance Escape School, I have a very small, very tiny frame of reference for these things. Not 10 years in captivity, a much smaller amount with my own countrymen, but it was funny for me to sit there and go, oh, I know exactly the line that they're trying to run him down. I understand exactly the kind of way they're working him over. And in my own mind, I could sit there and I could say, and I could absolutely see why these other aviators, these other officers took the parole and went and did it. And it's was an interesting kind of sidestep for me to go out of this discussion of looking at very introspectively negative things about the US military and suddenly going, oh, thank God we had a code of conduct. Thank God by the time I was in the military, I was trained in what to expect the enemy to do to me in a prisoner of war situation and to understand the implications. Now, obviously, we can have a whole separate historical discussion about were there any real repercussions for the officers that took the parole or not. But at the end of the day, it reinforced in my mind why there was so much SEER training about return with honor. And the fact is that they always will teach you. They know they're going to break you. Every human has a breaking point, but return with your honor. Don't willfully give up that which you have control over. So
Yeah, fascinating.
yeah, it's just one of those perspectives you either have because you've been there, or you fortunately may not have experienced it, and it's a wonderful thing. So, as you discussed that the section about captivity, moving on from that, it becomes an interesting discussion in the post-war phase, where it becomes really, in my mind, a dissection of who the post-war history writers were. Now that you do talk about what Hartmann did, how he ran afoul of higher command, things he may have said or done that were not taken well or received well. But I think the real meat of that section is the breakout into who the movers and shakers were in writing the history. What do you want people to kind of walk away from that section with?
Well, it was the Germans who were trusted with that to a large extent, and it was.
And should that surprise Americans that it wasn't Americans really writing the history? It was Germans writing about their own actions.
Well, I mean, yes and no. On one hand, it makes sense because this was the start of the Cold War, and the Germans had just finished fighting the Soviets, right? And so, the American leadership really wanted to know. They wanted to extract as much intelligence and as much useful information from that experience, the victories and the defeats, as possible, because there was a real urgency right away. In different parts of the book, I talk about the quickness of how we shifted perspectives, where the Soviets, who had been our allies, were now in this sort of sneaky, almost subconscious way, the enemies, and then the Germans, who were the vanquished enemy, were now the people who we were relating with, and there are plenty of reasons for that.
Well, yeah, it's now suddenly a very existential threat of the Soviets there that hadn't been there to the Americans, and it's a strange and uncomfortable rebalancing of
Yeah, yeah.
the moral and value judgments that have been made about people previously.
Yeah, I mean, one of the books that I used in the research was a survey of the Cold War, and it Gaddis by Gaddis, I think, and it starts with a scene of that initial meeting of American and Soviet troops who have, they've closed off, they've closed the fronts, and they're shaking hands, in this sort of ceremonial meeting of allies having defeated Germany. And the author talks about how, even at that point, it was awful awkward, and there was sort of a kind of an unspoken wariness because the seeds of the Cold War were planted before what we recognize as the Cold War starting, after the war. And so it's complicated, but it's interesting to see how that stuff's connected.
Well, as one of my history professors was often happy to remind me that in the 1940s, children of Soviet Russia were always educated about how American expeditionary forces had invaded them during the Crimean War. And so there was always a long distrust between the two powers that suddenly, when a common enemy is gone, I think that uncomfortable pause afterwards, when you're shaking hands and realizing, wait a minute, now only one of the two of us is going to walk out of this next historical contact intact, and that's a sobering realization.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so, something was coming. People realized, I think.
Right. Well, the interesting historical parallel for me, one being a history buff, and two being a product of the war in Afghanistan, is the same procedures and the same processes that applied in 1950, 60 Germany for historical revisionism, I'll call it, or treating people nicer in history than maybe they should have been, happens again. It happens when you have allies of convenience. And I probably will also make some special operations people and friends of mine mad here when I, call out the fact that, Abdul Rashid Dostum, General Dostum, an absolutely fascinatingly brutal, in all the wrong ways kind of person who suddenly becomes the best friend of the US, even after he's been a guy who has fought on the side of the Russians in Afghanistan, killing his own countrymen, then fought on the side of his Uzbeks, killing other people, and then finally become one of the most trusted advisors of special operations, getting into Operation Enduring Freedom to get into Afghanistan. Suddenly you have to rewrite history. And suddenly, this individual, even in social media posts from NATO and the US, is this wonderful Afghan general when he's a three-time over traitor to different parts of his people. So these are lessons we don't learn. These are lessons we continually repeat. And I think, let's be honest, they've been repeated since the dawn of history. That when you find the enemy of my enemy, you suddenly make them your friend. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't delve into and at least have a historical honesty about what are these people's backgrounds, what have they done. Some people are more repentant about their previous history, others are not, and I think you really get into that in the following section, in the analysis section. But for fans of Hartmann who don't want to necessarily get to those tough questions yet, I think the post-war section is also a fascinating discussion about an individual re-entering aviation. And it was funny to me to read the stories of him flying a Cub and going back and doing things that as a fighter pilot were extremely basic to him, but the U.S. Air Force was going to make him do them.
Yeah, I mean that was one of the more interesting phases of his career to me is just sort of the whole reacclimation process, right? I mean, he was gone for 10 years. He came back, just weighing 100 pounds. West Germany had been created in his absence. I mean, excruciatingly, his wife had given birth to a son while he was in the camps, who he never met, and he learned, and the son passed away, and he learned of this, God knows how much later, right? I mean, and so he comes back to this West Germany that, as he described it, and as everybody described it, in the massive, as they called it, the economic miracle, this revival, was just this totally different place, and he really felt like, what am I going to do? What am I going to contribute, right? And so this was another point in his life where there was strangely good timing, right? Because when he came back, almost to the month, that's when Adenauer and the West Germans were rearming, right? They were creating a new air force, and initially I think he was kind of reluctant, wasn't sure if that's what he wanted, but a lot of the old aces told him, look, that this is your best shot at a paycheck and normalcy, and doing something that you can manage, that is familiar to you, that you can contribute at. So yeah, there he went, right into the new Air Force, and kind of going back a few steps. I think initially, in terms of the training and the expectations and jumping through the hoops, but they made him they put him in charge of the first all-jet fighter wing in the Bundeswehr. Flying American. Well, they weren't American; they were Canadair Sabre jets, and so just a story about timing, and that was his place, and then that's what he could bring after that experience.
Well, and I think that starts some of the hero worship, at least in the U.S. Air Force, because as much as I make fun of my Air Force compatriots, one of the things the Air Force is really good at doing is finding people with experience, collecting their lessons learned, and discussing on a very personal level with them what they can take away. And I have no doubt that when Erich Hartmann showed up at Luke Air Force Base and some of these other locations doing his training, uh, the pilots that surrounded him, even though they were his instructor pilots, were keen to learn, what he had to offer, and to hear the stories, and not necessarily to hear them in. And I apologize. I'll make this delineation between civilians and military, not necessarily to hear them in a civilian fanboy way, but to hear them as military pilots. And what did you really do? And really, did you get 352 kills, or how many of those were your wingmen, either getting a kill that you then logged, or how many could you really validate? And I think there probably were a lot of very frank behind the scenes discussions that, in a sense, only helped Hartman's story be told, because people obviously found him relatable. They obviously found him to be a good pilot, and that reputation carries weight. As you say, he gets the first jet wing in the Bundeswehr, which is not a minor task to be given over to just anybody in the post-war era.
Yeah, although there was a scuffle at the beginning, and as his early biographers describe it, sort of a potentially scandalous debate over his incoming rank. Because the
Right.
record, the records were sort of iffy right at the end of the war. What he ended at and what he should come in as, and there he in a strange kind of way, his second Air Force career was in some ways harder for him than the first. Right, he kind of set some traps for himself. Some in the act of being correct, right? I mean, you referenced earlier, some things that he did that kind of rubbed some other people the wrong way. One of the most famous one is him objecting to the West Germans buying the F-104 Starfighter as their replacement fighter, and he was correct in predicting that it was more plain than their infrastructure and their training would be able to handle, and there was a bribery scandal involved in a lot of those deals. This was
The deal of the century.
Yeah, I mean, this was a very interesting and complicated time on a lot of ends. But I found it kind of another especially human episode to see him try to navigate the new system. Where he had this kind of elevated status, and like you say, certainly among the pilots, this kind of inherent, trust in his expertise and things like that. But it was also a very different organization very deliberately a different organization. And over time, I think he sort of kind of felt like a relic, from some other place. And eventually he retired early. I don't exactly know if that was on sort of unspoken recommendation from up above, or if that's just because he made the call. But his struggles in that environment are pretty interesting.
I think you've really hit the nail on the head as you have a discussion about the Bundeswehr and how it is formed and how it is created. And it's not built as a cadre of warriors. It's almost as if you put accountants in charge of the military. Uh, and from my
Oh yeah.
experiences serving alongside German units in a variety of locations, it's always funny to see a very similar reflection on their leadership from the junior officers and the mid grade enlisted, and it's really fascinating to me to hear someone else say that, because there's definitely, at least in my mind, it is coalesced that the headquarters organizations were not at all representative of what the common line soldier or line airman felt. And in fact, that a lot of times they felt their own needs, wants, desires, especially, the F-104 is that writ large, when almost anybody who was not on the take and had a knowledge of how the German pilot cadre was working, they knew they weren't going to need that kind of airplane. Yet it was what had been foisted on them by Lockheed and a lot of foreign military sales, just dirty deals, to say, to leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what Hartmann got, when he raised the objection, because his superiors basically said, hey, look, the decision has been made. Passive voice,
Right.
just
Shut
let's
up in color.
yeah, let's let this one go, and not ruffle too many feathers, because he already kind of had, when he put the Black Tulip on the sabers, for morale or whatever, the idea of dredging up that symbol from the war days, that had already
Well,
kind of made some people look at him
and that's a
skeptically.
fascinating discussion, because I was fortunate to go through flight training in the mid to late 90s. And so I had German military officers who had actually served in a variety of German militaries. In other words, half of my students actually had time as East German officers before the fall of East Germany and its reassimilation, and the other
Yeah, no
half
kidding.
were West German officers. And perspectives about something as simple as the Black Tulip were fascinatingly diverse. I was talking to some friends of mine today about symbology, and I said it was surprising to me to see in the discussions of symbology things that East Germans didn't find offensive that West Germans wanted to be immediately removed, and vice versa. And it was just it told me what was the post-war indoctrination on either sides as to the evil of certain symbols or the other things that just were adopted because either a unit need to be rolled into that country's military or whatever.
Well, and again, that was fluid too, right? Because that was temporary. That was a temporary scuffle. I mean, if you look at the commemorative schemes that West Germany put, on everything from the Phantom on. Well, I mean, they used the Phantom forever. So there's a handful of different schemes that they used on their F4Fs that are just dripping with the tulip design,
Yes.
right? And
Yes.
so this was a passing thing, it was kind of part of that initial, I think, kind of cold wave of reality when guys like Hartmann from the war had to sort of integrate in the new system, where there was just some discomfort and probably confusion over regulations and standards and procurement processes, because the one who questioned Hartmann on this most directly, as I understand it, kind of tried to make it a question of like paint, and sort of like a
Right, which I found
resource
funny.
allocation. Yeah.
Exactly. It wasn't that it was a symbol from World War II. It was that, how dare you take this extra paint, put it on your airplane, which will
Yeah.
cost us more money. It will make it slower. It will make it less combat ineffective. It will be
Yeah,
at
yeah.
97% efficiency instead of
Yeah,
98%.
right.
A very German way of looking at things, mind you.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
but it was funny. It was that level of offense, that how dare you do something out of your station, wing commander, rather than how dare you bring this symbol from your wartime career.
Yeah. I mean, and when you change an organization like that so drastically, I mean, you just have to think. I mean, I should be asking you about this. You just have to think that there are so many potential points of confusion and complexity and conflict and misunderstanding and bureaucracy and everything else. And on top of that, they really reworked the purpose of the organization, where this was a civilian run organization. It is as far from the chest beating World War II independent military as we can get. I mean, it just must have been a tough time probably for everybody involved.
Yes, and my friends who served in northern Afghanistan and the Mazar-e Sharif and places like that with the German military have fascinating observations about things that you expect out of a military organization. That either the Germans look at them and they go, "No, we don't do that. That's not how we do business," or things that their leadership frowns upon, but are things that all of us do as military people, such as songs and chants and things like that. But obviously in the post-war German world, things like that have such Nazi overtones of large events and things like that that they're severely frowned upon.
Yeah, there's one anecdote that kind of struck me. When they had the initial ceremonies and they initiated the new Air Force, people remarked that the uniforms looked an awful lot like the ones from World War II. And I can't remember right now if it was Adenauer or one of the military leaders, but they said, basically, well, wait a second, these might look like the same uniforms, but now they have civilian rubber soles on the boots.
Yes.
So it was, there was a lot
Also a very, very German answer to the question.
Yes, yeah. It was a trying time, I think, for everybody.
These are, in fact, civilian 20 millimeter cannons that are inside the airplane, not military 20 millimeter cannons.
Right.
Perfectly
right.
different. They're only for self-defense, not for offensive action.
Ostentatious peacefulness, I think, is
Exactly.
one way that
Yes.
the German military was described in comparison to others.
Absolutely. Well, before we talk about the analysis, I know we've been talking for quite a while here, and we're going to keep going because this is a great topic, a great subject for us to go through. I wanted to talk symbology because it was fascinating for me to read your experience about coming face to face with a reenactor with the Totenkopf on his collar for a variety of reasons. Um, One, because symbology means things. Uh, Also because I'll make a plug for my fellow friends in the Anything But a One podcast. They just released an episode discussing symbology and discussing that what it means to one person it doesn't mean to another, and the difficulty of assuming what you know. And there was an interesting moment of I'll say of brotherhood there, that I was happy to see somebody who was from a family with Germanic background was as revulsed by that symbol as I am. And I tell people that I will never forget seeing a family member, an extended family member, wearing a Totenkopf on his hat in a photo. And fortunately for that individual, I didn't see him in person because it probably would have been hard to deny in court the marks of my fingers around his throat.
Wouldn't have ended well. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's a very visceral reaction that you describe, seeing the reenactor, and I think that's something that people have to understand about history is you never know what symbology is going to cause people to think or to do. And my family had left Germany well before the Second World War, but the fact is there's still, at least in parts of my family, a shame over that, even though they were American citizens at that time. They're like, how could something like that happen in our country, and how could people do things as symbolized by SS symbology, Panzer Division, Third SS Panzer Division symbology, like the Death's Head. Um, and I think we just have to be honest about that symbology. Did you run across any of those other things dealing with Hartmann's biography?
Well, I'm interested to hear you say that. It sounds like we have kind of similar gut reactions and backgrounds. I mean, the scene you're talking about was was in that phase zero. It was in that introduction, where I'm sort of introducing myself to the reader and kind of, where I'm coming from. And you make, I think, exactly the right point, which is symbols represent real things. We all kind of witness them and derive meaning from them in different ways. Yeah, I mean, it was a strange moment. I remember it, and I remember just sort of the involuntary response to it, and almost immediately, that kind of sense of revulsion sort of faded away, and I got really interested in my own response, right? Because it was something that was completely unexpected to me. It was kind of pre-conscious, right? And so, this was not a sophisticated, rational response yet. This was
Exactly.
so often, the emotion comes first, and then the rationality may or may not come later. We kind of try to
Right.
convince ourselves that it's the other way around, but this was a fascinating experience to me, and I felt like putting it in there in sort of that initial section, both to sort of plant the seed in the reader's mind that symbols are going to end up mattering. And in fact, the symbol, I mean, the Black Tulip itself is literally the title of the book. It was sort of the originating metaphor for the whole project, back in grad school when I started researching it. But also that, I'm as taken by my own experiences and as shaped by my own background as any of us are. And I thought that it was part of the work that I needed to do in kind of exploring that, not to make the book about me, but to be able to kind of be real about where I'm starting and how I'm kind of looking at some of these things.
Well, I think for us as I speak for the Lead Pursuit, members as war gamers, it's always one of the most interesting things for us to see people's response when we are surprised that symbology affects them. Now, it's always easy for us as historians to say, "We'll deal with it. Tough luck." The German BF-109s had swastikas on their tail because that was the recognition insignia. Get over it. But I think the mature individual in us has to realize that those symbols are going to cause a reaction for people of a variety of ethnic backgrounds, a variety of religious and historical backgrounds, and it's one of those things that I think we have to be sensitive to. I think we also have to understand where it comes from and be prepared to have those kind of person to person discussions and relations and realize there may be times that historical accuracy is not needed. What is needed is to teach history rather than to put a barrier in front of somebody. I know the example the guys at the Anything But a One podcast used in their episode today was they said, if I was going to teach people about American Civil War and I was going to use a war game to do it, would I put the Confederate flag and the blatantly battle flag, Army of Northern Virginia flag of the stars and bars on units that were out there? Or would I put a different flag or leave flags off entirely? Knowing that that flag itself
Interesting.
could be a stumbling block to even having a discussion about lessons learned from the American Civil War. And fortunately, one of the guys on that podcast is a park ranger, and he tells the joke of when he worked at Manassas, half the time he had to be a Confederate guy talking about being a Confederate soldier, and half the time he was a Union guy talking about being a Union soldier, because
Oh, interesting.
both stories had to be told. But you you have to know how to, first of all, reach your audience before turning them off. And I think that, I'm going to pontificate for a moment. I think for us as war gamers, that's something we need to be probably more sensitive to rather than less sensitive, but not shy away from having the tough discussions. But anyway, I'll get off my soapbox and I'll move on to I'll move on to your pontification, to your analysis section.
No, I mean, the soapbox you're on should probably, have more feet on it, more time, more lengths of time as we go. These are hard and interesting questions. I think you brought up a couple different sensitivities that we can afford to have with things like this. Not just what do symbols mean for people, but I mean, you talk about wargaming and things like that, and I mean, I'm an obsessed scale modeler, always have been, right? Since I was a kid, I've built plastic models of military planes, everything,
Then you know our poor, terrible addiction.
Oh man, I mean, talk about obsession, right? Like, yeah, it goes way back and it goes deep. Yeah. So I think we're nerds of a similar variety in that sense. You know, that kind of
Absolutely.
passion. You know, but I sort of started having this conversation with myself about a lot of the things you just described, because you know the Eric of 5 years ago building a model of a Messerschmitt BF 109 probably would have thought about that differently than I do now, right? I mean, back then, you know, having had the experience of researching and writing Black Tulip, right, and of course all the other things that we are and ought to be aware of, you know, in society today. Back then, it seemed a little bit more sufficient to me, I think, to sort of tell myself, well, you know, this is just a decal. You know, this swastika, it's, you know, I'm mostly concerned with its, you know, the accuracy of its proportions and its coloration. You know, I know that I'm not.
You are one of those rivet counters, aren't you?
Oh goodness, don't get me started. I mean, we gotta restart the recording if you want to get into that stuff.
Exactly.
You know, but there's sort of this distinction that I've sort of wrestled with, where I think in this context, and I'm speaking mostly, I'm talking about myself here in this modeling, but I think maybe other folks can relate. You know, you're building a model of a German machine or whatever, you know, BF 109. And the idea is it's one thing to say, well, I'm not supporting Nazism, or I'm not supporting racism or hatred by doing this, which can be completely accurate to you, right? You know, and authentic. It's that's not the same thing as, you know, let me put this a different way. Avoiding supporting something bad is not the same thing as actually supporting something good, right? So,
Yes.
you know, in my past modeling life before, honestly, I had a lot of strange and hard conversations with myself about Hartmann and all the things we've been talking about. I probably would have thought about that a lot less, right? You know, but now, you know, a month ago, I bought a model of an Airfix 1/48 scale BF 109E. It's a quality kit, you know, and I had a slightly different conversation with myself about it. And I'll be perfectly honest, I haven't resolved that conversation yet. But it's been honestly one of the gifts of this experience, having, you know, gone through the years more than I would like to admit of doing the research and writing the book, that I'm kind of looking at a lot of things in a different kind of way. And, you know, to go back to the start, you know, symbols matter. Our creative output has all kinds of different implications, and each person is going to have their own kind of way in and their own experience of it. But it's something that's got me thinking.
Well, it came full circle to me today as I was in the process of figuring out what models, what paint schemes would go into the next wargaming demo kit that we left with the store. And it suddenly hit me that my very default answer to Trevor, one of the members of the podcast who does my commission painting for this stuff, when he said, "Hey, you're doing 109s, do you want swastikas on the tail?" I'm like, yeah, whatever. We want swastikas on the tail. Then I suddenly thought today, and I said, well, you know, first of all, if I'm gifting it to this store, is that a question that I answer? Or is that a question that the store owner really answers? What does he want in his display case? Is he perfectly representing history, or does he want a model that anyone will take out of the display case and play with and you know, enjoy a game with, and not feel a burden, historical or otherwise, on? And it was just an interesting thought to go through, and I don't know where my, you know, end result thoughts are. I'll be honest, because there's always just like modelers, war gamers were always bad about at the end of the day going, why can't we just do what history did? Well, because history's full of bad things. Somebody has to be the bad guys, and unfortunately, the bad guys sometimes don't need to be perfectly represented. You know.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're starting from the right approach, though, which is getting out of your own frame of reference to think about it, right? You're thinking about,
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
the other guy, and I mean, that gets complicated and hard to even contain in your brain at times, you know, these decisions. But yeah, I mean, it's just, I think about modeling and all this, and it's awful easy to kind of just stay in your happy place with all this and this history. And I speak from experience, and just sort of trying to figure all that out.
Well, and I think that's the whole port to your analysis section is that you really, at the end of the book, you realize you have raised more questions than you probably will ever have answers to, but it is the process. It isn't so much that we know exactly who Erich Hartmann was and why he did everything he did, but the process of analyzing and being honest about it, rather than assuming that the history that was very glowing that was written of him that minimized either Nazi involvement or why he chose to continue fighting on the Eastern Front against the Russians. That it really it's the process more than the end result. So I won't quote again from you. I'll quote from another guy we interviewed, a guy I consider a good friend, Jay Stout. When he wrote, he said, "I'm jealous. It's a wonderfully different and wonderfully written work. Schmidt is no fawning fanboy of the greatest ace of all time. Instead, he is a sympathetic and insightful researcher who produced an engrossing and thoughtfully wondering analysis." And I think he's being nice when he says thoughtfully wondering. I love how Jay said that. But yes, you do hit all points, and you tell us right up front it won't be in chronological order. But he says a thoughtfully wondering analysis of the multidimensional Hartmann that is unlike and better than anything ever done. And I think if you take what Jay said there, the point is you really dig into, but no, you can't answer the question of who Erich Hartmann is. And I think that's the takeaway from the analysis.
Yeah, and at some point, there was a moment in the process where I figured out that I just had to let myself off the hook from deciding about, Erich Hartmann as a man, right? But, who was he in his
Now, as you say that, I
this
can see that in the
black and
writing.
white.
I don't,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't think I caught that until you said that. But yes, now I see that.
Because, I mean, frankly, that's artificial, right? This neat tidiness, this clarity that we in a lot of ways are really drawn to in history, and especially in difficult conversations that are hard to resolve. That's that clarity, that's about us. That's something that we impose on history, not something that's particularly natural in it. And that was kind of one of those guiding ideas that I sort of accidentally became a believer in the more I learned about Hartmann. And so eventually, my mission with the book was not to give people a new, refreshed, or substitute, truth with a capital T about Erich Hartmann. And, here's, what thou shalt think about what, this guy, and then let's move on to another dogfight scene and talk about camouflage colors. Like there was always going to be that unresolvable part of it. And I actually think that that's kind of the point, right? A large point of the book is that this clarity that we seek, this simplicity that we seek in things that are difficult for us to resolve, that's about us. That's something that we're bringing to it, and we end up with one-dimensional comic book characters if we're guided too much by that, and if we can't sit with complexity, and if we can't sit with ambiguity. Because I mean, you're going to write a biography about a soldier from World War II Germany. You better be able to tolerate some ambiguity and some complexity, or else you're building the story in maybe a suspect kind of way.
I think that is probably the hardest piece for a lot of us to come back to, and I think we want our heroes to be heroes. I may disagree with you on some of your discussion of the anti-hero in there, because I don't think it's I don't know. I don't think it's a cultural phenomenon. I think it's something that's been there since the dawn of time. I think we have, if anything, in recent history, made polarized heroes. I don't know. I could easily be wrong on that. But I think there's certainly a point where we need to come to an understanding of why we continually tell these people's tales. And I draw our purpose for the hero, everything back to the earliest days, and it's really a collection of the lessons learned. And so if it's only the good, then you're never going to know the mistakes not to make. And whether you're reading Odysseus, whether you're reading um, all my other great epics are escaping me at this time. My literary teachers would be so ashamed.
I won't tell.
Whether you're thinking about any one of them, then you're really missing the point that there has to be the good with the bad, and there has to be the flawed hero, and there has to be an understanding of the hero's motivations. So I really enjoyed the book. I know we've gone on much longer than our podcasts usually do. So I obviously need to wrap this up, but I enjoyed the book. It is a difficult but enjoyable read. And I say it's difficult because it requires introspection. And I really thank you for that piece, because it was good for me as a military veteran to undergo some of that introspection with questions asked about something that happened years ago, not forcing me to look directly in the mirror of my own career, but mirroring through someone else's. So I think that's an invaluable thing to take away from the book.
Oh, well, thanks, and I appreciate your perspective on this too. I've learned from you here too. Thanks for inviting the conversation.
Absolutely. Steve, I know we've kind of run over you in this whole conversation, haven't let you speak. Steve, any last minute questions, thoughts, or otherwise?
No, it's fascinating. It's one of the great things about wargaming is I'm very much into with my background, the engineering side of it, the aviation side of it. And truthfully, I am a huge hero worship fanboy guy, right? Like, oh yeah, Richtofen 80 kills. Oh yeah, Erich Hartmann 352 kills. So to kind of, step out of the pop culture and into more of the cerebral kind of thinking of who these guys really were is just the fun thing about wargaming, that the hobby kind of leads you down different paths and you never kind of know what you're going to be exploring.
Yeah, I can relate to that too, though. I wouldn't say, Steve, that any of us have to feel guilty about having the passion and the excitement and all that. It's just both things can exist at the same time, right? We can have the enthusiasm and be drawn to these stories and the dogfight scenes and contrails over Britain during the Battle of Britain, and this evocative it's all evocative. It's fascinating, and at the same time we can look at something from a different point of view and sort of I'm kind of referencing myself and my own history, sort of challenge the happy place a little bit.
Absolutely. Sometimes it's good to make you feel uncomfortable reading history. Brett, anything you'd like to offer closing up?
Well, just to say, it was a very thoughtful book that's been mentioned, but something you just said, Eric, made me think of it. We have this fascination with something that we forget is super terrible at the same time, and it's something we certainly don't wish on our children. So you help explore that without it simply being, all the fun stuff, and glamorous. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning it, Brad. Appreciate it.
Well, Eric, thanks for showing up on the podcast and enduring our questioning for an hour and a half and going through the topics.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really enjoyed the book. Like I said, I think for most of our Blood Red Skies players and wargamers that are out there, it will make you uncomfortable. It's a book you should read. It's got questions you should ask. It is not full of the of contrails and bullets and wonderful stories of how aces are made, but it tells you the story that is around how the people who become aces are made and what are their ways of thinking and what are their belief systems. So I highly recommend the book to everybody. Have a chance to go out there, pick up the book, tell us what you think. Please leave us feedback, good, bad, or otherwise. Throw your spears early, as people have been wont to do on the Lead Pursuits page, and leave us feedback there on Facebook, on Instagram, social media, all over the place, or on our website. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate you taking the time to listen, and we will talk to you soon about something involving gaming. Thought I clicked on record. All right, guess what? The first technical glitch of the night.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Brett's throwing in my backup on that, like, hey, dude, you didn't hit record. I clicked it didn't start. So we're going to start again.
Shit, I'm going to have to remember what I said. All right.
Yeah, exactly. We'll say something totally different. No one will ever know. That's the best part.